We have a pretty massive stack of sources on the table today. I mean, we were looking at official marine inquiry transcripts, turn-of-the-century newspaper clippings from the Australian coast, naval casualty records, and even architectural shipbuilder drafts.
Yeah, it is a mountain of paperwork. But, the mission of this deep dive is to synthesize all of this raw historical data to understand what is, frankly, a profoundly terrifying maritime phenomenon.
Exactly. Because everything in these documents, all of it, centers around a single name, Dunmore.
Right.
And through these records, we're going to explore two entirely distinct real-life horror stories at sea. I mean, we are looking at a transatlantic apparition that basically defied the laws of physics,
Yeah.
and a wooden coastal steamer that became a literal floating magnet for disaster, bloodshed, and death.
And when we look at these primary sources, we really have to approach them with a specific mindset. I mean, these aren't just dry historical footnotes about cargo routes. They are testaments to the sheer vulnerability of human beings out on the water.
Yeah, you really have to put yourself in their boots.
Absolutely. We are stepping into an unforgiving, hostile environment where the ocean is the antagonist. It's a place where, a single dozing crewman or a sudden gale in the pitch black or even just the snapping of a tow line can instantly lead to a watery grave.
Right. And to really understand that vulnerability, I want you to put yourself in this environment. Just picture this. You are standing on the deck of a ship. It's late 1905, maybe early 1906.
Cold, dark, middle of winter.
Exactly. You are somewhere in the middle of the freezing, unforgiving expanse of the North Atlantic Ocean. The water is pitch black. A dense, freezing fog rolls in, completely swallowing the horizon and muting the sound of the waves.
It's that eerie, dead silence.
Yes, and you're straining your eyes against the mist, and suddenly this massive silhouette emerges. It is a 3,652-ton iron leviathan. Her masts are fully intact, reaching up into the gray sky.
Just looming out of the fog.
Right. She is floating perfectly upright, cutting through the water. She looks completely inhabited, like she is being commanded by a vigilant crew. But as you ring your ship's bell, as you call out into the fog, the only answer you get is the eerie, rhythmic creaking of cold iron.
Because there's no one there.
Nothing. There is no one at the helm. There is no one on board at all. This is the transatlantic ghost freighter, Dunmore.
It's just a deeply chilling historical reality. I mean, when mariners spotted this vessel, they were experiencing a very specific, visceral type of psychological horror. This was an 1884 iron freighter. She was built in Newcastle-on-Tyne, England, and the records describe her as a schooner-rigged vessel.
Hold on, before we get too deep into the specs, let's make sure we're picturing this right. When you say schooner-rigged on a giant iron freighter, what are we actually looking at? Because I usually associate schooners with those sleek wooden sailing yachts.
Oh, right. It's a really good distinction. So in this era, even massive steam-powered iron freighters still carried sails as a backup or, an auxiliary power source.
So they weren't relying totally on coal.
Exactly. A schooner rig just means she had fore and aft sails on her masts. Those run parallel to the length of the ship rather than the big square sails that hang across the deck.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, it allowed these heavy iron beasts to catch the wind and save coal on long oceanic hauls. So you have this massive, heavy industrial iron hull, towering masts, and she was abandoned in late 1905. The official reports actually state she was abandoned, quote, under circumstances that left it drifting upright.
That specific phrase in the source material really bothers me. Drifting upright. I'm looking at the weight here. Nearly 4,000 gross tons of iron. How does a heavy iron ship just get left behind yet remain perfectly balanced and seemingly under command? Doesn't the ocean's kinetic energy usually, tear derelicts apart or flip them over?
In almost every standard case, yes, it absolutely does. When a ship loses power and is abandoned, it loses its ability to steer into the waves, so it turns broadside sideways to the swells.
Right, which is the worst possible angle.
Exactly. At that point, the ocean's energy usually rolls the vessel, capsizing it, or drives it onto a reef where it's pulverized in a matter of days. To understand how anomalous the Dunmore was, the sources provide a contemporary contrast.
The SS Valencia. Right?
Yes, take the SS Valencia. In January 1906, right in the exact same time period the Dunmore was drifting as a ghost ship, the Valencia struck a reef off the coast of Vancouver Island. The ocean ripped her to shreds almost immediately. The violence of the sea is usually fast and total.
But the Dunmore defied that physics.
Mm-hmm.
She didn't capsize. She somehow achieved this eerie, perfect equilibrium.
She likely had an incredibly stable center of gravity at the time she was abandoned, perhaps due to the way her remaining cargo was distributed down in her holds. Her watertight bulkheads must have held perfectly, sealing the air inside her iron compartment.
So she just refused to sink.
Right. Instead of dying, she became a phantom. She just wandered the Atlantic for months.
The psychological toll that takes on the shipping lanes is fascinating to me. I mean, it's one thing to see floating debris, a shattered lifeboat or some wooden planks.
Yeah.
That is tragic, of course, but it's a known quantity.
Right. Your brain understands it.
Yeah, your brain processes it. A ship sank here.
Yeah.
But when you are out there in the freezing fog and you see an empty ship mimicking the behavior of a living vessel, that violates the natural order of the sea.
Oh, totally.
It's a 300 to 600-ton iron battering ram with literally no one steering it, drifting silently through the shipping lanes.
It's the horror of the uncanny. You see the ship, you think you might need to yield the right-of-way, or perhaps they need your help. You maneuver closer, the fog parts, and you realize you are looking at a floating corpse.
Wow, that is such a haunting image.
It really is. It eventually vanished forever, likely finally succumbing to a storm or a slow leak, but it left a permanent mark on maritime lore.
Well, that transatlantic ghost ship vanished into the mist. But halfway across the world, right around the same time, another ship bearing the exact same name was beginning a decades-long reign of terror along the Australian coast. And this is the core focus of our sources today.
Yes, and we need to clarify the clustering of this name to ensure the historical record is straight here. There was the 1884 iron ghost ship we just discussed. There was also a massive four-masted steel bark named the Earl of Dunmore, built in 1891, which occasionally visited Sydney Harbour.
Right, but that's not our ship.
No, our primary subject, the vessel that generated this massive stack of casualty reports, marine inquiries, and death records, is an 1891 Australian wooden-hulled coastal steamer simply named Dunmore.
I want to reconstruct this Australian Dunmore in meticulous detail because the physical environment of this ship is crucial to understanding why she became a magnet for chaos. She was built at the Rock Davis shipyard at Blackwall in New South Wales. The naval architect was a Sydney marine engineer named John Wildridge.
And if you dig into the background of that design firm, J. Wildridge and Sinclair Ltd., you find a very unnerving detail. Wildridge's partner, William Sinclair, was the designer behind another coastal vessel called the Undola.
Oh, right, the Undola.
Yeah, the Undola is infamous in Australian maritime history for vanishing with all hands. It's almost as if a dark cloud hung over the drafting tables of this specific engineering firm.
Let's talk about the anatomy of the ship herself.
Mm.
Because she wasn't some sleek, fast passenger liner. She was an industrial beast of burden. She was 131 feet long with a beam of 25 feet. Her hull was constructed from thick colonial hardwood. The sources mentioned Cowrie deck planking, a top-gallant forecastle, and an 11-foot deep hold. I mean, what does it actually feel like to stand on this vessel?
It feels heavy, it feels cramped, and strictly utilitarian. Cowrie is a type of timber native to New Zealand. It was prized because it can be cut into long, straight, knot-free planks that are incredibly resistant to saltwater rot.
Which you definitely need in the ocean.
Exactly. But wood is a living material. When a ship like this hits an ocean swell, that timber groans and flexes. The top-gallant forecastle you mentioned is simply a raised deck at the very front of the ship, the bow.
Okay, so up near the front.
Right. And down inside that raised section is where the crew would sleep, in these cramped, damp bunks, literally listening to the hardwood smash against the ocean waves just inches from their heads.
God, that sounds awful. And driving all of this heavy wood was the heart of the ship. A Muir and Hansen triple compound reciprocating steam engine. Explain the mechanics of that if you would, because the sheer violence of early steam engines plays a huge role in these stories.
Oh, absolutely. A triple compound engine was the absolute pinnacle of industrial muscle at the time. You have a massive steel boiler operating at 160 pounds per square inch of pressure.
That is a lot of pressure.
It's massive. That steam is piped into a small, high-pressure cylinder. It slams the piston down. Then, instead of venting that steam, it's routed into a second, medium-sized cylinder to expand again and drive a second piston.
So they're reusing the steam.
Exactly, getting every bit of power. Finally, it exhausts into a massive third low-pressure cylinder. It extracts every single ounce of kinetic energy from the coal they were burning. This engine produced 358 horsepower.
So when that engine is running, I'm imagining the entire 131-foot wooden hull is just violently vibrating. It's a rhythmic, thumping mechanical heartbeat just vibrating right through your boot.
Exactly. It's inescapable. And the owners of this ship, G.L. Fuller and Sons, they needed every bit of that horsepower. The name Dunmore actually came from George Lawrence Fuller's birthplace in County Galway, Ireland, and their estate near Shell Harbour.
Right.
The Fullers owned a massive quarry at Bass Point. They built this ship specifically for what was known in the maritime community as the Blue Diamond trade.
The Blue Diamond trade. You know, it sounds like something out of a jewelry heist, but the reality is so much more brutal. They were part of the Stone Fleet.
Yes. Blue metal is a type of crushed volcanic rock, primarily basalt. It was desperately needed to pave the expanding roads of Sydney and for railway ballast. We are talking about heavy, jagged, incredibly dense gravel.
And when you look at the operational logistics in these records, it is just staggering. The Fullers built a 500-foot wooden jetty right out into the open ocean at Bass Point. 4 times a week, the Dunmore would steam up to this exposed wooden structure. The crews would load 300 tons of this crushed volcanic rock into her 11-foot deep wooden hold.
300 tons!
And they were expected to do it in under 2 hours.
The sensory assault of that environment is hard to even overstate. Just imagine the deafening, apocalyptic roar of hundreds of tons of jagged rock cascading from chutes down into the wooden belly of this ship.
The noise must have been incredible.
Ear-shattering.
Yeah.
And the abrasive dust is choking the air, coating the crew's lungs and eyes. And as the rock pours in, you feel the ship settling lower and lower into the water, losing its buoyancy, basically transforming from a nimble vessel into a heavily laden, sluggish wreck.
For a few years, she did this job. She was a working-class ship, occasionally hauling coal as a 60-miler on the side. But as we know, the ocean doesn't care about your work schedule. In September of 1894, the sea decided to really test the Dunmore, and it tested her in the dead of night.
This is our first major disaster in the sources. A violent westerly gale was tearing across the coast off Coal Cliff. Now, a westerly means the wind is screaming off the land, pushing out to sea, whipping the ocean into a completely chaotic frenzy.
It's blowing them away from safety.
Right. The Dunmore is steaming north. She is fully laden with cargo. She is sitting incredibly low in the water. Every single wave is a physical, violent impact against her wooden hull.
And then the mechanical heartbeat just stops. The records say her tail shaft and propeller snapped off entirely and just dropped into the ocean. Why does a solid metal drive shaft just shear off like that? I mean, is it poor maintenance?
It's really a combination of immense physical stress and the physics of heavy seas. As a ship pitches over massive waves, the stern, the back of the ship where the propeller is, often lifts entirely out of the water.
Okay, I can picture that.
When the propeller is spinning in the air, there is no resistance, so the engine races wildly. Then, a second later, the ship crashes back down, and the rapidly spinning metal blades slam into dense seawater.
Oh, wow. The sudden drag.
Exactly. The sudden, violent torque transfer places incredible torsional stress on the tail shaft. Do that thousands of times over years of service, and you develop severe metal fatigue. In the middle of this 1894 gale, that fatigue reached its breaking point. The shaft just sheared.
So in a fraction of a second, a fully laden 277-ton wooden ship is instantly transformed into helpless driftwood. That 358 horsepower engine is now just dead weight. Now, earlier we talked about how a ship dying in the water turns broadside of the waves. Let's really explain the physics of that terror to the listener. It's not just about losing speed, right? It's about losing your rudder.
That's the critical mechanism of disaster at sea. A rudder only works if water is flowing past it. If you have no forward momentum, steering is mathematically impossible.
You're just a sitting duck.
You are. You cannot point your bow into the oncoming waves to slice through them. The ocean currents and the wind will naturally push the massive surface area of the ship's side. So you roll into the troughs, those deep valleys between the massive waves.
Which is terrifying in a fully loaded ship.
It's lethal. Once you are broadside in a trough, a heavily laden ship is in imminent danger of rolling completely over, or simply being battered until the hull seems burst open.
The crew realizes they have maybe minutes before the sea claims them, and their solution is a phenomenal display of desperate skill. Because she was an auxiliary steamer with that schooner rig we talked about, they had sails.
Thank God for those sails.
Right, in the pitch black, with the deck pitching wildly at 40-degree angles, freezing water crashing over the rails, the crew has to climb the rigging.
They hoisted whatever canvas they could manage onto those masts. They were trying to use the very screaming wind that was threatening to sink them to generate just enough forward momentum to regain steering control.
The bravery that takes.
Unbelievable. The physical exertion required to haul heavy, wet canvas sails in a gale in the dark on a violently rocking deck is just immense.
And the sources map out this agonizing timeline. From the moment the shaft snapped, they fought this gale for 5 solid hours. They finally approached Sydney Heads around 9 p.m. But they couldn't just sail into the harbor, because that screaming westerly wind was blowing straight out of the harbor entrance, constantly pushing them back to sea.
So they were trapped right at the door.
Exactly. They had to zigzag, beating against the wind, inching forward in the dark. It wasn't until 2 a.m. that they finally managed to drop their anchor.
And they dropped it near a jagged rock formation near the North Head quarantine station, ominously named the Old Man's Hat. They spent the rest of the night pitching at anchor, totally exhausted, just waiting for dawn. The next morning, they were finally towed to Pyrmont, unloaded, and sent for repairs.
They survived. They
Yeah.
beat the ocean. But, reading these accounts, it feels like surviving that 1894 gale fundamentally changed the ship. Because 8 years later, the Dunmore enters a new phase. Her bad luck turns lethal. Not for her own crew, though. She becomes a harbinger of death for whoever crosses her path.
Which brings us to May 1902, the sinking of the Kelloe. This incident is a study in the nightmare of the dozing watch.
It's 1:30 in the morning. We are 2 miles off the Botany Bay Heads. Pitch black. The Dunmore is running unladen. She has dropped off her stone and is heading back south to the quarry. Because her 11-foot hold is empty, she is riding high up in the water.
And heading in the opposite direction, inbound for Sydney, is the Kelloe. The Kelloe is an entirely different beast. She is a massive, steel-hulled, 60-miler collier.
So she's made of steel, not wood.
Exactly, and she is heavily laden, carrying a crushing weight of 600 tons of coal from the South Bully Jetty. She's essentially a deep, heavy steel wall moving blindly through the dark.
And this is where we have to pause and look at the human element in these records. The Marine Court inquiry transcript reveals a terrifying fact about the second mate of the Kelloe, the man responsible for keeping watch. He had practically zero sleep in the previous 24 hours. Now, we aren't talking about missing a night of sleep in a comfortable bed. We are talking about 24 hours of relentless physical labor on a 1900s steel collier.
The economics of the coastal trade practically mandated exhaustion. Crews were kept to the absolute bare minimum to maximize profit. You worked loading the coal, you worked maintaining the ship, and then you were expected to stand watch in the dead of night.
It's a recipe for disaster.
It is. Put yourself in his boots. You were standing on the bridge.
Yeah.
The drone of the steam engine is a hypnotic, constant hum. The ocean is gently rocking the deck. The absolute blackness of the night offers no visual stimulation. The sheer physical weight of exhaustion drags your eyelids down. Your brain simply shuts off.
He dozes off. And out there in the dark, the heavy wooden bow of the Dunmore is bearing down on them. The mate wakes up, but it is too late. The Dunmore's hardwood bow rips violently into the steel starboard side of the Kelloe, right in the area of her main cargo hold.
I really want to break down the physics of a wooden ship fatally wounding a steel ship, because it sounds kind of counterintuitive. How does wood pierce steel?
Yeah, you would think the wood would just shatter.
Right. But it's about concentrated force. The bow of the Dunmore is a heavily reinforced wedge of thick colonial hardwood. The side of the Kelloe is steel plating held together by iron rivets. When thousands of tons of forward momentum are concentrated onto the sharp point of that wooden bow, it acts like a chisel.
Oh, wow.
It doesn't necessarily shatter the steel plate. It shears the rivets, popping them out like bullets, and buckles the metal plates inward, ripping open the seams of the hull right below the waterline.
And the timeline of destruction here is breathtaking. 15 minutes. The crew of the Kelloe wakes up in the pitch dark to the sound of screaming metal and splintering wood. Then comes the immediate, terrifying roar of the freezing ocean violently pouring into the hull.
We need to explain why she sank so fast. A steel ship floats because the air inside its hold displaces a volume of water equal to the weight of the ship. But the Kelloe's hold is packed with 600 tons of coal.
And coal doesn't float.
Exactly. The moment the ocean breaches the hull, the water rushes in, completely displacing the remaining air. The structural buoyancy is obliterated almost instantly. A massive steel box filled with heady rocks, and water becomes an anchor.
It is a 600-ton steel coffin sinking into the abyss. There is a frantic scramble in the dark. Men are fighting to get on deck as the angle of the ship tilts violently. The Dunmore, which just inflicted this mortal wound, is heavily damaged herself. Her wooden bow is smashed, but she manages to launch a rescue boat in the dark, pulling the surviving crew of the Kelloe from the freezing water as their ship vanishes into the deep.
The Dunmore barely survived the night herself. With water pouring into her own shattered bow, she limped through the heads of Botany Bay. The only thing that prevented her from sinking right alongside the Kelloe was her captain making a desperate decision to intentionally run her aground, violently beaching her on the sand at Cornell to keep her from going under.
Looking at the inquiry afterward, well, this is where the historical reality really bites. The mate admitted to dozing off. His exhaustion caused the loss of a massive steel ship and nearly killed 2 entire crews. But the court noted his previously good record, and no punitive action was taken against him at all.
None.
It highlights how entirely accepted these razor-thin margins of error were. The industry knew they were working men to the bone, and occasional catastrophic destruction was just the cost of doing business.
It was an occupational hazard, but for the Dunmore, a dark pattern was emerging. She had survived a dismasting gale. She had survived a fatal collision with a steel ship. But as we move forward in the timeline, the threats to this vessel become increasingly bizarre. It wasn't just the weather or other ships anymore. The violence started coming from the sky and from within.
Yet the records from 1906 and 1907 mark a distinct shift. In the lore of sailors, a ship that is constantly at the center of destruction begins to feel cursed. The crew develops a hypervigilance. They step onto the deck and wait for the other shoe to drop. They literally believe the ship is attracting dark energy.
When you have a vessel that constantly finds itself in the crosshairs of disaster, human psychology naturally looks for a pattern, a curse, to explain the statistical improbability of so much bad luck, and the events of 1906 would test the sanity of any rational sailor.
March 1906. The Dunmore is cruising past the coast near what is now the ANZZ rifle range. There's a red warning flag flying from the headland, which is the military signal that infantrymen of the 1st Australian Infantry Regiment Militia are actively conducting live-fire rifle practice.
Very dangerous area to be in.
A standard protocol requires a safety vessel, a submarine mining ship called the Miner, to patrol the water and block civilian ships from entering the firing zone. But on this specific day, the Miner is inexplicably absent.
So the Dunmore, continuing her regular coastal route, sails directly into the line of fire. Suddenly, a fusillade of high-velocity, copper-jacketed military rounds rains down on the wooden steamer.
Think about the sensory shock of that moment. You're shoveling coal or hauling lines, and suddenly the air is cracking with sonic booms. You hear the sharp, violent thud-thud-thud of military bullets impacting the colonial hardwood. Splitters of wood are flying like shrapnel across the deck.
And we know exactly the damage these rounds caused from the ship's logs. One bullet tore straight through a solid cork life buoy mounted on the rail. Another smashed entirely through the wooden structure of the bridge.
Just ripping through the ship.
Yeah. One penetrated the thin hull of one of the ship's lifeboats, rendering it totally useless. Another bullet hit a heavy, 4-inch thick manila mooring rope at the aft of the ship and sliced clean through it.
The randomness of it is terrifying. A bullet punched through the wooden exterior of a copper air tank and embedded itself deep inside. The ship's mate was casually leaning against the ship's mechanical telegraph. A split second after he moved, a military round ripped through the exact spatial coordinates where his torso had just been. He missed being shot through the chest by inches.
It was friendly fire, an accident born of poor military communication, but for the crew, it just reinforced the terrifying aura of the Dunmore. I mean, the very sky was shooting at them.
And if the external world wasn't attacking them, the violence manifested on board. Jump to June 1907. The Dunmore is discharging a load of coal at Blackwattle Bay in Sydney. An argument breaks out on deck. A former seaman from the ship, Giovanni Imborne, who is now working as a coal lumper, pulls out a revolver and fires 2 shots point blank at another worker, Charles Hanson, right amidst the coal dust and the noise of the unloading process.
A simple workplace dispute escalating to attempted murder. Imborning was subdued and charged, but you have to look at this through the eyes of the crew. They survived a dismasting, sank a steel ship, got strafed by a militia regiment, and now there are gunfights on the deck. The psychological toll on the crew's morale must have been devastating.
At what point do you quit? But these men needed the wages, so they kept shoveling coal, they kept hauling stone. But all of these bizarre omens and near misses were just a prelude. Nothing in the history of this ship or the history of Sydney Harbour could prepare anyone for the absolute devastating horror that unfolded on a clear January morning in 1909.
We are entering the darkest chapter in the Dunmore's history, the Encounter mass drowning. Let's set the parameters of this event, because the alignment of variables that morning is chilling.
It is January 1909. It's 6:45 in the morning. The sun is up. The water of Sydney Harbour is calm and gleaming. We are just off Mrs. Macquarie's Point, The Dunmore is inbound, heading for the gravel wharf at Woolloomooloo Bay, her hold heavy with blue metal scone.
Sharing the harbor that morning is the Royal Navy. A steam-powered launch owned by the Garden Island Naval Depot is acting as a tug. It is towing a naval pinnace, which is a large, open wooden boat used to transport personnel.
Yeah.
Inside that towed open boat are 67 young sailors from the cruiser HMS Encounter. They are en route to the man-o-war landing steps.
67 men in an open boat being towed by a rope behind a steam launch. The harbor is busy, the vessels are moving, and the Dunmore approaches. The trajectory, the speed, the momentum, it all perfectly aligns for maximum catastrophe. The heavy wooden bow of the Dunmore strikes the tow line connecting the launch to the pinnace.
When a heavy ship strikes a taut tow line, one of two things happens. Either the rope snaps violently, or the immense weight of the advancing ship catches the rope, pulling the towed vessel rapidly forward into its path.
Like a slingshot.
Exactly. In this case, the Dunmore dragged the wooden pinnace directly under her own bow and violently rammed it.
The collision instantly shatters the wooden naval boat. 67 men are thrown violently into the deep, freezing water of Sydney Harbour. But here is the agonizing detail from the naval casualty reports that turns this from a tragic sinking into an inescapable nightmare. These 67 sailors were not dressed for a simple transport. They were heading ashore for live-fire rifle practice.
Which means they were heavily encumbered. They were carrying the standard military issue of the time.
Think about the panic of hitting the water. The shock of the cold causes you to gasp, filling your lungs with water. You try to kick your legs to swim to the surface, but you are wearing thick, heavy military canvas leggings that restrict your knees and soak up water like a sponge.
It's just dragging you down.
You try to use your arms, but you can't. You have a heavy, wood-and-steel Lee-Enfield military rifle slung tightly across your back. You have heavy leather belts and canvas ammunition pouches strapped across your chest.
The physics of the human body in water are completely altered by this gear. The rifle across the back shifts the center of gravity, making the men top-heavy, forcing them face forward into the water. The tight leather straps pin their deltoid and pectoral muscles, physically restricting their ability to rotate their shoulders and swim.
They couldn't move.
There is a chilling eyewitness account from an observer looking down from the deck of the Dunmore. He described watching the sailors drowning in the water, stating they were, quote, triced up like stuffed chickens, end quote.
Triced up like stuffed chickens. Immobilized, weighed down by heavy metal, thick leather, and soaked canvas. They couldn't save themselves. They were just sinking. Imagine the desperate, horrific struggle beneath the surface of the harbor. Men clawing blindly in the murky water, fighting to hold their breath, trying with freezing, panicked fingers to unbuckle heavy leather straps that are swollen with seawater.
Above the surface, it was absolute chaos. The crew of the Dunmore and the sailors on the naval steam launch initiated an immediate, frantic rescue effort. They threw ropes, life buoys, and physically reached into the water to drag these incredibly heavy, waterlogged men onto the decks. The physical strength required to pull a dead-weight man wearing a water-filled uniform and carrying a rifle out of the ocean is immense.
If the response hadn't been instant, the death toll would have been total. They pulled men from the water who were completely limp, their faces blue, effectively dead. On the wooden decks, they immediately began grueling attempts at artificial respiration.
Which was very different back then.
Right. And remember, in 1909, they weren't using modern CPR. They were using primitive, physically demanding methods of manually pumping the victim's arms and compressing their chest to force water out and air in. And miraculously, they actually managed to revive 3 sailors who had no pulse when they were pulled aboard.
But despite the sheer heroism of the rescue crews, the heavy military gear did its lethal work. 15 men drowned that morning. 15 young sailors dragged to the bottom of the harbor by their own weapons.
The emotional aftermath of this disaster paralyzed the city of Sydney. Reading the newspaper clippings from the days that followed, the mourning was absolute. The sources describe a massive, somber funeral procession. Picture the silence of a massive crowd lining the streets, watching 15 flag-draped coffins being carried from the man-o-war steps, solemnly marched down Macquarie and Elizabeth Streets, all the way to Central Station.
Those 15 coffins were loaded onto a specially designated funeral train. They were transported to Rookwood Cemetery and buried in a massive combined gravesite 50 feet wide in the Anglican Naval Section. A heavy stone memorial was erected. It was one of the most staggering losses of life in the harbor's history.
This tragedy actually forced a permanent change in military protocol. The Royal Navy investigated the mechanics of the drowning and learned a bitter, undeniable lesson from the victims of the Dunmore. They permanently banned the practice of sailors slinging rifles across their backs or wearing heavy accoutrements while traveling in small open boats. It was a safety regulation written entirely in blood.
The legal fallout was also intense. The naval coxswain who was steering the steam launch towing the pinnace was actually arrested and tried on a charge of manslaughter, although the jury eventually acquitted him. But once again, the blame, the guilt, the sheer trauma radiated outward from the hull of the Dunmore.
You would naturally assume that after ramming a boat and causing the horrific drowning deaths of 15 men in the middle of a major city harbor, the Dunmore would be decommissioned, that the Fullers would say, "Enough, this vessel has too much blood soaked into her timbers. We are scrapping her."
You would think so.
But they didn't. The brutal economics of the era dictated that the expanding roads of Sydney desperately needed more crushed blue metal stone. So the Dunmore fired up her boiler and she kept going.
Which leads us into a relentless, terrifying final decade. The sources from 1910 to 1925 read like a rap sheet for a repeat offender. We can categorize this era as the hit-and-run years. The ship cemented her status as a constant looming coastal menace. The sheer frequency of collisions defies statistical probability.
Let's examine this timeline because it proves the point. The very next year, November 1910, the Dunmore is steaming back into Sydney Harbour. And in almost the exact spatial coordinates where the 1909 massacre occurred, right off Mrs. McCory's Point, she collides with a steam launch called the Lady Hopeton.
The same spot.
Exactly. The physical damage was slight, but the psychological echo of that collision happening in the exact spot of the mass drowning must have deeply unnerved anyone watching.
The violence escalates again in April 1914. It is 1 a.m. just off the massive cliffs of the Sydney Harbour heads. Another pitch-black night. The Dunmore is heading outbound, empty. Inbound is another vessel belonging to the Stone Fleet, the steel-hulled Kiama, deeply laden with hundreds of tons of crushed stone. The two ships fail to navigate the dark, and they collide.
Think about the sound of that impact. The colonial hardwood bow of the Dunmore violently smashing into the heavy steel plating of the Kiama. But this time, the steel wins. The Dunmore pulls away with a massive gaping hole ripped completely through her bow right below the waterline. The dead of night, the black ocean roaring into the forward compartments.
A terrifying situation.
The crew is standing in the dark, listening to her interior watertight bulkheads groaning, the wood splintering and warping under the immense crushing pressure of the ocean trying to force its way through the ship.
It became a desperate race against physics and time. The water was rising fast, destroying her buoyancy. They managed to steer the sinking wooden ship toward land, intentionally driving her hard aground at Lady Bay before the bulkheads blew and she sank in deep water.
The Marine Corps inquiry for the 1914 collision was scathing. They placed the blame squarely on the master of the Dunmore. They cited him for failing to keep a proper visual lookout in the dark and blatantly ignoring right-of-way navigation regulations. They suspended his master's certificate.
He was completely at fault.
They also blamed the mate of the Kiama for failing to reverse his engines to avoid the crash, though legally they couldn't punish him. Once again, it is the theme of exhaustion, complacency, and sheer human error resulting in massive destruction.
But the Dunmore was patched up, refloated, and sent right back to work. August 1915. She is lying at anchor at Port Kembla. She isn't even moving. And a ship called the Southborough, attempting to maneuver out of the harbor, blunders into her and strikes her.
And just weeks later, September 1915, the Dunmore is carrying a heavy, deep load of coal. A blinding, disorienting coastal fog rolls in near Bradley's Head. The Dunmore pushes blindly through the mist, her crew unable to see the coastline, and she grinds violently onto a submerged rocky reef.
She was stranded hard on the rocks, heavy with coal. They had to bring small, lighter barges alongside her in the fog. The crew engaged in hours of backbreaking manual labor, using shovels to transfer tons of coal out of her hold to lighten her draft.
So they're just shoveling by hand in the fog.
Exactly. Once she was light enough, they fired up her 358 horsepower engine, threw it in reverse, and literally dragged her wooden belly, scraping and gouging, off the jagged rocks.
3 years go by. February 1918. She is in the harbor and smashes directly into a tugboat named the Champion, causing significant structural damage. The Marine Corps blamed the tug's master this time, but the reality is that the mere presence of the Dunmore seemed to act as a catalyst for maritime chaos.
We also have to acknowledge from the sources that the trail of violence surrounding the Dunmore wasn't contained strictly to the water itself. The sheer brutal industrial nature of the Blue Diamond trade meant the wharves where she birthed were scenes of horror as well. The records detail a horrific incident in May 1898. A worker was deep inside her dark, 11-foot hold at Parmont, guiding the loading process. High above him, a heavy, suspended basket overflowing with jagged blue metal gravel snapped, dropping directly onto the man and crushing him instantly.
In June 1911, another tragedy strikes the unloading crew. A wharf laborer is working at Permont. He is standing on a narrow, suspended wooden plank high above the deck of the Dunmore, maneuvering the chutes. He loses his balance and falls violently, plunging down and smashing onto the solid wooden wharf below.
That is a brutal fall.
The sheer toughness of these men is horrifying.
Yeah.
He actually got up, pumped full of adrenaline, and kept working his shift.
Wait, really?
Yeah, he kept working. But his internal injuries were massive and catastrophic. He died in agonizing pain in Sydney Hospital 3 weeks later. The ship constantly demanded a toll in blood, broken bones, and lives.
As the 1920s arrived, the very infrastructure that supported her brutal existence began to die. The ocean, patient as ever, began to reclaim its territory. In January 1922, a massive, violent southerly gale slammed into the coast. The towering waves completely shattered and wrecked the 500-foot wooden Bass Point jetty where the Dunmore had loaded stone for 3 decades.
The port of Shell Harbour had always been notoriously treacherous. Navigating a heavily laden wooden steamer into that exposed port without wrecking required incredibly deep, specialized local knowledge. With the jetty gone and road transport slowly beginning to modernize, the era of the small wooden stone fleet was closing.
Which brings us to the final chapter of the Dunmore. After surviving the 1894 dismasting gale, after violently sinking the steel Kelloe, after taking military crossfire, surviving onboard shootings, causing the deaths of 15 naval sailors, and smashing into reefs and tugboats, well, her end was completely devoid of spectacle.
March 1925. The Dunmore is sitting quietly at her moorings in Waterview Bay, Balmain. She'd been inactive for a while. There was no screaming westerly gale tearing at her rigging. There was no exhausted mate blindly steering a 600-ton steel collier into her ribs.
It was as if the vessel was simply, finally, physically exhausted by 3.5 decades of relentless, violent trauma. The colonial hardwood had flexed too many times. The Kari planks were tired. In the quiet, still waters of the bay, a seam finally gave way. She sprang a leak, slowly filled with cold harbor water, and sank silently into the mud.
A completely silent sinking. A whimper instead of a bang. The cursed wooden steamer finally went down and stayed down.
The Blue Diamond trade itself had a somewhat ghostly epilogue. During the desperation of the Second World War, surviving stone ships like the Patterson and the Bombo were requisitioned by the government for the war effort, sweeping for mines or hauling supplies. The narrow-gauge railways at the quarries rusted and closed.
It was the end of an era.
It was. But in 1951, a second vessel named Dunmore entered the coastal trade, a massive steel-hulled former Dutch East Indies oil tanker. But even she couldn't escape the dark legacy of the name. She was sold, renamed the Fijian Trader, and in 1964, she too ran hard aground and was violently wrecked. The sea always reclaims its own in the end.
When we step back and look at this massive stack of historical records, what is the core truth we extract? We started this deep dive talking about the 1884 transatlantic iron Dunmore, the ghost ship, abandoned, drifting aimlessly in the freezing fog, mimicking life. We fear the concept of a ghost ship because it feels supernatural. It violated the natural laws we rely on to feel safe.
But when you study the meticulous, bloody legacy of the 1891 Australian Dunmore, it provides a deeply haunting reflection on what we should actually fear. The true horror of the ocean isn't supernatural at all. The real monsters aren't phantoms drifting in the mist.
No, they're much more mundane.
Right. The real monsters are sheer biological human exhaustion. They are the blinding coastal fogs and the deafening, disorienting roar of a sudden gale tearing off your propulsion. The most terrifying antagonist in maritime history is human error, a dozing watchman pushed past the limits of endurance, a misjudged distance in the dark, a failure to understand the lethal physics of a heavy tow line.
The most terrifying maritime stories in our history aren't about the dead ships drifting silently in the Atlantic. They're about the living ones. Ships built of heavy hardwood, carrying 300 tons of jagged rock, commanded by tired, freezing men who were being pushed by an industry beyond safe human limits. Those are the ships that were out there waiting in the dark to violently drag you down to the bottom.
It leaves you with a profound question about the nature of survival at sea. Does a ship like the Dunmore truly hold a curse, absorbing the dark trauma of every near miss and tragedy until it becomes a floating, chaotic weapon? Or is the ocean simply a vast, mathematically unforgiving void, patiently waiting for tired men to make a single fatal mistake?
Think about that the next time you look out over the dark water of the coast at night. It looks calm on the surface, but underneath it's just waiting.